My bones always screamed before the snow came. It was the only gift the pits ever gave me, this cruel, precise clairvoyance of ache. I could feel the pressure drop in my shattered knuckles 3 hours before the first flake fell, could taste the coming freeze and the grinding of my molars. In the underground fighting rings of the lower district, that trick meant survival. When the frost crept through the cracked ceilings and turned the clay floor to ice-slick death, I knew exactly where to plant my feet. I knew which opponents would slip, which strikes would land, which falls would break instead of bruise. I thought pain was just the rent you paid to keep breathing. A mundane, everyday transaction. You woke up, you hurt, you ate whatever slop they threw in your trough, you hurt some more, you bled, you slept, you repeated. Pain was the currency of my existence, and I had been wealthy beyond measure for 23 years. 23 years of this. 23 years of iron collars and hemp rope, and the sour, coppery stench of terror soaked into every stone of every cell I'd ever occupied. 23 years of learning that groaning meant you had breath to spare, and breath to spare meant you could take another hit. So I learned to be silent. I learned to fall in ways that scattered the damage across my bones instead of concentrating it in one place. I learned to make myself small, invisible, forgettable. But then the vampire lord bought my contract. And everything I thought I knew about pain, about survival, about what it meant to be an omega in this world, it all shattered like ice under a boot heel. The carriage will hit a rut, and the jolt drove a spike of pure kinetic agony up my spine. My jaw clamped shut, grinding my molars until they squeaked against each other. I didn't groan. Groaning meant you had breath to spare, and breath to spare meant you could take another hit. It was a lesson beaten into the marrow of my ribs by the time I was 12. I was shoved into the corner of the transport box, my shoulders wedged against the splintered wood. The box smelled of stale straw, old vomit, and the sharp coppery terror of a dozen omegas who had occupied this space before me. Their fear had soaked into the grain, fermented in the dark, and now it hung in the air like a second skin. My wrists were bound with raw hemp rope. Iron collars were too expensive for the transit of damaged goods. And make no mistake, I was damaged. My left eye was swollen shut, a pulsing mass of purple and black from my last bout in the mud rings. The dried blood on my cheek cracked every time I blinked, flaking off in rust-colored pieces that caught in the stubble I hadn't been allowed to shave in weeks. My right eye, my good eye, I kept fixed on the sliver of gray sky visible through the slats. Outside, the world was a blur of sleet and skeletal trees. We were climbing higher into the mountains. The air here tasted thinner, biting cold, lacking the heavy smog of the lower city. It tasted like pine needles and ozone, clean and sharp and utterly alien. My contract had been sold. That was the long and short of it. The pit boss hadn't even looked me in the eye when he handed the papers over to a man in a tailored wool coat. I was 23, but in pit years, I was a walking corpse. My joints popped, my lungs rattled, and I'd long ago stopped counting the number of times I'd been told I wouldn't see the next sunrise. I fully expected to be bought by some lower-tier factory owner who needed cheap, disposable labor for the chemical vats. Omegas didn't last long in the fumes. Our respiratory systems were too delicate, too prone to collapse, but we were cheaper than machines. We were replaceable. Instead, I was going to an estate. The carriage lurched to a halt. The heavy iron latch on the door clanked open, letting in a gust of freezing, wet wind that bit through my threadbare rags like teeth. Out. The driver didn't look at me. He just held a heavy wooden cudgel, tapping it rhythmically against his thigh. A warning. A promise. I dragged myself forward. My knee locked, a parting gift from a brute twice my size 3 days ago, and I stumbled as my bare feet hit the cobblestones. The stone was freezing, the cold so sharp it felt like burning. I registered the temperature as a vague annoyance rather than a shock. Pain was pain. Cold was cold. I'd stopped distinguishing between gradations of suffering years ago. I stood up straight, or as straight as my hunched shoulders would allow, and I looked at my new reality. It wasn't a house. It was a fortress of pale, weeping stone. High-arched windows stared down at me like hollow eyes, their glass reflecting the bruised purple-gray of the winter sky. The heavy oak doors at the top of the grand staircase stood open, spilling warm amber light into the miserable rain. 2 men stood in the doorway. Even from 20 yards away, the sheer crushing weight of their pheromones hit me like a physical blow. Alphas. But not the crude, sweat-stinking street alphas I was used to fighting off in the pits. This scent was refined, suffocatingly heavy, pressing down on my lungs until I gasped. One smelled like crushed cedar and frost, cold, ancient, aristocratic. The other smelled of dark earth and thunderstorms, wild, powerful, untamed. Vampires. A bitter laugh bubbled up in my throat, dying before it reached my lips. Of course, a vampire lord. They had a reputation. They were fastidious, aristocratic leeches who liked their omegas docile, pretty, and unblemished. Someone had made a massive clerical error. I was a collection of jagged gristle and scar tissue. I smelled like dried blood and fear, and the cheap lye soap they used to scrub the fighting pits between bouts. Bring it inside. The voice drifted down from the steps. It was a baritone smooth as glass, but carrying an edge that made my bruised ribs ache. The alpha command threaded through the words, subtle but unmistakable, a velvet-wrapped blade that demanded obedience without asking. The driver shoved me between my shoulder blades. I didn't stumble this time. I walked up the steps, my bare feet leaving damp, muddy prints on the pristine white marble. Good. Let them see what they bought. Let them be disgusted and throw me in the scullery where I belonged. The foyer was ridiculously warm. The sudden heat made my skin itch, the blood rushing to my extremities in a painful pins and needles flood. I stood in the center of the mosaic floor, dripping rainwater and grime, while the 2 alphas descended the remaining steps. The first one was massive, broad-shouldered, with hair the color of rusted iron pulled back at the nape of his neck. His jaw was covered in heavy stubble, and his eyes were a pale, piercing amber that seemed to glow faintly in the candlelight. He was the one who smelled of storms. A shifter, I realized. A wolf, if the scent of deep woods and wet earth was any indication. He moved with the coiled, canonical grace of a predator, and his gaze when it landed on me was sharp, assessing, hungry. Gideon. The name floated in the back of my mind, a whisper from the driver earlier. The enforcer. The muscle. The second was taller, leaner, moving with a fluid, terrifying grace that confirmed exactly what he was. His skin was pale, almost translucent in the warm light, and his hair was ink black, falling across his forehead in careless waves. His eyes were a startling cold silver, the color of winter moons and frozen lakes. He wore simple black clothing. No frills, no ostentation, but the power radiating from him was anything but simple. Alistair, the Lord. The cedar and frost. Alistair didn't speak immediately. He just looked at me. His gaze felt physical, like a cold hand ghosting over my bruised jaw, down my throat, lingering on the filthy rags that hung off my frame. I met his eyes. It was a dangerous thing for an Omega to do. An act of defiance that usually earned a backhand. But I was too tired to care. I narrowed my good eye, waiting for the disgust to twist his aristocratic features. It didn't. Instead, a strange, absolute stillness fell over him. His nostrils flared just a fraction, taking in my scent. Not just the dirt. Not just the blood and fear. The underlying stress hormones. The sour tang of chronic pain. The bone-deep exhaustion of a body that had been running on adrenaline and spite for years. You're shivering, Alistair said. His voice was quiet. It didn't bounce off the marble walls. It seemed to sink directly into my ears, intimate and invasive. It's raining, I rasped. My voice sounded like gravel grinding together, rough from disuse and the copper taste of old blood. I cleared my throat, tasting more copper. I'm dirty. Where's the washroom? Gideon, the massive one, let out a low, rumbling growl at my lack of respect. The sound vibrated in my sternum, triggering a deeply buried instinct to drop to my knees and submit. I locked my knees and dug my fingernails into my palms, staying upright through sheer, stubborn spite. Alistair raised a single pale finger. Gideon silenced instantly. "Take him to the west wing," Alistair instructed, his silver eyes never leaving mine. "Have the staff draw a bath. A warm one. Not too hot, his skin is compromised." Compromised. What a clinical, sterile word for a body that looked like a butcher's block. I gave a jerky nod and turned, ready to follow whatever servant was assigned to drag me away. I just wanted a corner to curl up in. I wanted the aching in my bones to stop for 5 minutes. I wanted to be alone. The bathroom was the size of my entire holding cell at the pits. Dark slate and polished brass, filled with thick, cloying steam. The smell of lavender and crushed mint made my stomach turn. Too rich, too clean, too much. An older beta servant had drawn the bath, her eyes firmly fixed on the floor the entire time. She left a stack of impossibly fluffy white towels on a stool and hurried out, closing the heavy oak door behind her with a soft click. I was alone. I stood in front of the massive claw-footed tub, watching the steam curl in the air. The water was clear. I felt a sudden, irrational spike of panic. I hadn't bathed in clear water since I was a child. The communal troughs at the fights were always murky with soap scum, sweat, and whatever washed off the losers. Putting my filthy body into this pristine water felt like a crime. With trembling fingers, I reached for the knot of the rope binding my makeshift tunic. My joints were stiff, the cold from the journey finally settling deep into my cartilage. It took 3 tries to loosen the fabric. The tunic dropped to the wet slate floor with a heavy, wet slap. I caught sight of myself in the fogged mirror above the sinks. I wiped a streak across the glass with the heel of my hand. I hadn't seen myself in a mirror in over a year. It was worse than I remembered. My collarbones jutted out sharply against the pale, sickly tone of my skin. My ribs were visible, each one a ridge of bone with deep hollows between. But that wasn't what drew the eye. It was the geography of ruin mapped across my torso. Starting from my left shoulder, a jagged, raised keloid scar dragged diagonally down my chest, stopping just above my navel. A knife wound that had never been stitched, just packed with dirty gauze and left to knit itself together. My ribs on the right side were warped, healed improperly after being shattered in a bout when I was 16. Covering my lower stomach were the burns, livid, pink, and tight, a punishment for stealing half a loaf of bread when I was 15. And my back. I didn't need to turn around to know what it looked like. I felt the tight pull of the scar tissue every time I rolled my shoulders. Whip marks mostly. Some old, faded to dull white. Some newer, red and angry. A lattice of pain that told the story of my life in raised, twisted lines. I forced myself to look away from the mirror. I stepped into the tub. The water wasn't scalding, but against my freezing, battered skin, it felt like liquid fire. A sharp hiss escaped my teeth as I sank down, the water immediately clouding, turning a murky grayish brown as the filth soaked off me. I closed my eyes, letting the heat seep into my aching muscles. For a minute, just a minute, I allowed myself to relax. My guard dropped. The ambient silence of the estate was heavy, lacking the constant shouts, clanging metal, and whimpers of pits. For a single, blissful moment, I forgot where I was. I forgot what I was. The door latch clicked. My eyes snapped open. Adrenaline, sharp and acidic, flooded my veins. I scrambled backward in the tub, water sloshing over the edges onto the floor. I pulled my knees to my chest, a defensive posture, trying to make myself as small as possible. I tried to hide the burns. I tried to hide the knife scar. It was Gideon. The large alpha stepped into the room, bringing a cold draft with him. He had taken off his coat, wearing only a simple dark linen shirt that stretched tight over his broad chest. He held a small dark glass bottle in his hand. He stopped dead just inside the door. I watched his eyes. I waited for the sneer. I waited for him to call me a ruined piece of meat, to demand a refund from the pit boss. I braced myself for the strike. Gideon didn't move. The bottle in his hand trembled just slightly. His amber eyes were wide, fixed on my chest, my shoulders, the visible ridges of my ribs, the pink, puckered burns curling around my hips. The silence stretched, pulling taut like a wire about to snap. "Get out," I snarled. My voice shook, betraying my panic. "I'm washing. Get the hell out." Gideon took a breath. It was a ragged, shuddering inhale. The scent of pine and thunder spiked in the small room, but it wasn't the heavy, oppressive scent of an angry alpha. It was something else. Something that tasted bitter, that smelled like grief. Ooh. The word was barely a whisper, gravelly and thick. "What does it matter?" I spat back, grabbing a washcloth and scrubbing frantically at my arm. "It's just wear and tear. I work, I get hit. That's the deal. Now leave me alone." Gideon took a slow step forward. I flinched violently, splashing water. He froze instantly, raising his hands, palms open. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice rough. "I swear it on my blood. I'm not going to touch you. Liars. All of you." I muttered, my chest heaving. "Just let me wash so I can get to the scullery." "You aren't going to the scullery." Another voice. Alistair appeared in the doorway, standing just behind Gideon. The vampire lord's face was an unreadable mask of pale stone, but his silver eyes were fixed on the bathwater, on the pink, angry burn scars curling around my hips, on the twisted ruin of my ribs. A low, vibrating sound started in Alistair's chest. It wasn't a growl. It was a purr, but distorted, laced with a terrifying predatory edge. It was the sound a predator makes when it finds something broken and decides it belongs to them. "Gideon," Alistair said softly. "The salve." Gideon, slowly telegraphing every movement, walked to the edge of the tub. He placed the dark glass bottle on the brass rim. He didn't look at my face. He looked at the water. "It's for the bruising," Gideon mumbled, his voice thick. He backed away immediately, giving me space. "Wash," Alistair commanded gently. "Then dry yourself. There are clothes on the stool. We will be waiting in the adjoining room." They left, closing the doors softly. I stared at the bottle on the rim of the tub. I didn't reach for it. I scrubbed my skin until it was raw and pink, avoiding the deepest scars. I didn't understand. They weren't going to beat me for being ugly. They weren't going to put me to work. What did they want? A chilling thought crept into my mind. Some alphas like the broken ones. They liked the twisted aesthetic of ruining something that was already damaged. They liked the pain. I stepped out of the tub, my wet feet slipping slightly on the slate. I dried off with rough, frantic motions, ignoring the soft luxury of the towel. The clothes left for me were ridiculous. Soft dark gray cotton pants that hung loose on my starved frame, and a thick, oversized wool sweater that smelled faintly of cedar. Alistair's scent. Wearing an alpha's scent was a claim. It was a brand. I pulled the sweater over my head. The wool was incredibly soft, so soft it made my skin crawl. It felt like a lie. I rolled the sleeves up to my elbows, exposing the thick leather brace I still wore on my left wrist to support a bad sprain. I walked to the door. I put my hand on the brass knob. My palm was sweating. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the residual scent of thunder and frost, and turned the handle. The adjoining room was a massive bedroom. Heavy velvet curtains the color of dried blood blocked out the gray rain. A fire crackled in a massive stone hearth, casting long, flickering shadows across the polished hardwood floor. The bed was obscenely large, piled with furs and silk pillows. I hated it instantly. It was a cage wrapped in velvet. Alistair sat in a high-backed leather chair near the fire. Gideon stood by the window, staring out into the rain, his broad back tense. There was a third man in the room now. He was sitting on the edge of the hearth, poking the fire with an iron rod. He looked up as I entered. He had messy sandy blonde hair and wore wire-rimmed glasses. He looked entirely too normal to be here, until I caught his scent. Old paper, cloves, and the sharp, coppery tang of fresh blood. A vampire. Just like Alistair. But different. Quieter. Reese, Alistair introduced, not taking his eyes off me. He is the third of our pack. I stood by the door, refusing to step further onto the plush rug. Great. A full set. I crossed my arms over my chest, shielding myself. Now what? Do I clean the ash out of the fireplace? Or do you want me on my knees right now, so we can get this over with? The words tasted like battery acid, but I forced them out. I wanted to control the narrative. If I was going to be used, I wanted it done fast. No illusions of romance or gentle servitude. A heavy, suffocating silence dropped over the room. The crackle of the fire sounded loud as a gunshot. Gideon turned from the window. His jaw clenched so hard a muscle ticked wildly in his cheek. Reese stopped poking the fire. Alistair slowly stood up. He moved like smoke, silent and inevitable. He crossed the room until he was standing a mere 3 feet away from me. I didn't back up. I locked my knees and tilted my chin up, forcing myself to meet his silver eyes. "Do you believe," Alistair asked, his voice dropping to a low, resonant register that vibrated against my bruised collarbones, "that we brought you here to use you?" "I'm an Omega," I stated flatly. "Bought from a fighting pit. Look at me. I'm not here for my sparkling conversation." Alistair raised a hand. I didn't mean to, but my body betrayed me. I flinched, a hard, violent jerk of my head to the side, my shoulder rising to protect my ear. Muscle memory. A lifetime of conditioning, compressed into a single involuntary movement. Alistair froze. His hand hovered in the air between us. I saw something fracture behind his cold silver eyes. A crack in the ice. "Who did this to you?" The question wasn't gentle this time. It was a demand, laced with a sudden, terrifying pressure that forced me down onto one knee. The Alpha command. It crushed my lungs, making my vision swim. "Stop." Reese's voice cut through the pressure. The sandy-haired vampire was suddenly there, grabbing Alistair's wrist. "Alistair, you're crushing him. Pull it back. He's not built for that kind of pressure right now." Alistair blinked, as if waking from a trance. The invisible weight vanished. I slumped forward, catching myself on my hands, gasping for air on the thick rug. My chest heaved. I hated this. I hated being weak. I hated that a simple tone of voice could put me on the floor. "Don't," I choked out, pushing myself back up. "Don't do that. Don't pretend you care who hit me. You bought me. You own the scars now. So just tell me what my job is." Gideon crossed the room in 3 massive strides. He didn't use his alpha presence. He just dropped to his knees right in front of me, bringing himself down to my level. He reached out, his massive, calloused hands hovering just an inch from my arms. I could feel the heat radiating from his palms. "Your job," Gideon growled, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't place. It sounded dangerously like a sob, "is to heal. That's it. That's the only damn thing you have to do." I stared at him. I looked at Alistair, who was standing perfectly still, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. I looked at Reese, whose eyes were dark with ancient, quiet anger. They weren't looking at me with lust. They weren't looking at me with the cold calculation of an owner assessing damaged property. They were looking at me the way a wolf looks at a wounded pup from its own litter. It was terrifying. It dismantled everything I knew about how the world worked. Violence I understood. Cruelty was predictable. You could brace for a hit. You could learn to fall so nothing broke. But this suffocating, aggressive gentleness, I didn't know how to defend against it. "I don't understand," I whispered. The fight drained out of me, leaving me hollow and exhausted. "I'm broken." Alistair finally closed the distance. He knelt beside Gideon, the vampire lord in his immaculate clothes kneeling on the floor. He slowly, deliberately reached out and gently gripped my wrists. His hands were cool, a sharp contrast to Gideon's heat. With agonizing slowness, Alistair pushed the oversized sleeves of the wool sweater up my forearms. He revealed the thick, raised scars circling my wrists from years of iron cuffs. He revealed the mottled purple and yellow bruises fading on my skin. He didn't speak. He just lowered his head and pressed his lips against the inside of my left wrist, right over my erratic, racing pulse. A jolt of pure electricity shot up my arm. My Omega biology, star for healthy alpha contact, surged to life. A wave of dizzying warmth spread through my frozen limbs. I gasped, trying to pull my arm back, but his grip was unyielding, firm but entirely without pain. "You are not broken," Alistair murmured against my skin. His breath was hot against my pulse point. "You were simply in the wrong hands. You are ours now. And I swear to you, little wolf, the only pain you will ever feel in this house is the memory of the past fading away." He looked up at me, his silver eyes burning with a possessive, terrifying intensity. "We are claiming you, not as property, as our own. Do you understand?" I didn't. My mind was screaming at me to run, to hide, to find a dark corner and wait for the inevitable trap to spring. My heart was hammering against my ribs, terrified of the soft velvet cage. But as Gideon shifted closer, pressing his broad shoulder against mine, a tiny traitorous part of my battered soul thought, maybe I could rest. Just for tonight, asterisk. The bed was a trap. I lay rigid on my back, staring up at the canopy of dark, heavy silk. The mattress was stuffed with goose down. To a body accustomed to damp clay and splintered wood, the softness didn't feel like luxury. It felt like drowning. Every time I tried to shift my weight, the mattress swallowed my limbs, offering no resistance, no leverage. If someone came into the room to strike me, I wouldn't be able to roll away in time. I was pinned by comfort. My breathing sounded too loud in the cavernous bedroom. The fire had died down to glowing orange embers, casting long wavering shadows that played tricks on my good eye. Alistair, Gideon, and Reese had left me alone to sleep, locking the heavy oak door from the outside. They said it was to keep the staff from disturbing me. I knew it was to keep me from running. An hour passed. Maybe two. The ache in my improperly healed ribs began to throb in time with my pulse. The down mattress offered zero support for my twisted spine. I couldn't do it. I threw off the heavy fur blanket. It felt oppressive, weighing down my chest, and rolled to the edge of the bed. I let myself slide off. My bare feet hit the polished hardwood floor. The cold shocked my system, sending a familiar grounding shiver up my calves. Solid. Unforgiving. Real. I scanned the room in the dim light. Against the far wall sat a massive antique mahogany wardrobe. There was a narrow gap between its heavy side and the corner of the room. It was dark. It was tight. It only had one point of entry. I dragged my exhausted body across the rug, my knee giving a sharp, hot twinge of protest with every step. I squeezed into the gap, pulling my knees tight to my chest, wrapping my arms around my shins. I pressed my back against the hard, cold wood of the wardrobe and the plaster of the wall. It wasn't comfortable. My neck was cramped, and the floor dug into my tailbone. But the crushing anxiety in my chest finally began to recede. My perimeter was secure. The shadows couldn't grab me from behind. I rested my chin on my knees and let my eyes slide shut. I didn't hear the door open. Vampires don't make noise when they walk, and Reese was no exception. I only realized I wasn't alone when the faint scent of old paper, cloves, and sharp, metallic blood drifted into my corner. My eyes snapped open. Reese was standing 3 feet away. He wore a loose white shirt, the collar undone, and dark trousers. He held a thick, woven wool blanket draped over his left arm. He didn't look angry. He didn't look pitying. He looked at me with the mild, calculating curiosity of a scholar examining a strange text. I pressed myself harder into the corner, bracing my good leg to kick out if he reached for me. "The mattress is imported," Reese said quietly. His voice didn't have the heavy, commanding resonance of Alistair's, or the rumbling thunder of Gideon's. It was dry, slightly raspy. Most people find it quite pleasant. It's a sponge. I rasp, my throat's still raw. I can't push off it. Reese tilted his head, acknowledging the logic. He didn't tell me I was being ridiculous. He didn't order me back to the bed. Instead, he simply dropped the heavy wool blanket on the floor, right at the edge of my hideout. The floorboards in this wing are over 200 years old, Reese noted, stepping back to give me space. They hold the winter chill. If you're going to nest in the architecture, you'll freeze to the plaster by morning. He turned and walked toward the door. He didn't look back. Why? The words scraped out of my throat before I could stop it. Reese paused with his hand on the brass doorknob. He looked over his shoulder, the dim light glinting off his wire-rimmed glasses. Because a cornered animal bites, he said simply. And because trust isn't built by forcing someone to sleep where they feel exposed. Use the blanket, Elias. We have plenty. The door clicked shut. The lock did not turn. I stared at the closed door for a long time. Then slowly, my hands trembling with a mixture of cold and profound confusion, I reached out and pulled the blanket into the dark corner with me. It smelled faintly of cloves. It was rough, heavy, and grounding. I wrapped it around my shoulders, closed my eyes, and for the first time in 5 years, I actually slept. I woke to the smell of lemon oil and roasting meat. My body protested violently as I uncurled from the tight space between the wardrobe and the wall. My joints popped like dry twigs. The bruising on my ribs had deepened overnight into a spectacular palette of sickly yellow and violent violet. But my mind was sharp, clear. The survival algorithm kicked in automatically. I was awake. The sun was up. Therefore, I was late for work. In the pits, if you didn't earn your keep by sunrise, scrubbing the blood off the clay, hauling the heavy slop buckets, sharpening the crude iron weapons, you didn't get your water ration. I didn't know what the punishment for idleness was in a vampire lord's estate, but I had no intention of finding out. I left the wool blanket folded neatly on the floor. I ignored the oversized soft clothes laid out for me, instead pulling on the dark gray cotton pants from the night before. I left my chest bare. I didn't want to ruin their fine clothes with cleaning chemicals. I slipped out into the hallway. The estate was massive, a labyrinth of pale stone and heavy oak. But finding the kitchens was just a matter of following my nose. I crept along the walls, keeping my head down, making myself as small as possible. I found the scullery just off the main kitchen. 2 older beta women were moving frantically, hauling massive copper pots from a cast iron stove. The floor was wet, slick with soapy water and grease. One of the women, a stout beta with flour in her hair, hoisted a heavy wooden bucket filled with dirty scrub water. Her grip slipped. The bucket hit the stone floor with a loud, hollow crack, splashing gray, foul-smelling water across the flagstones. "Oh, bloody hell," she hissed, grabbing a mop. This was my opening. I darted into the room, dropping to my knees right in the puddle. I grabbed a coarse bristle brush sitting by the sink and started scrubbing the greasy water toward the floor drain. I ignored the shooting pain in my bad knee. I ignored the cold water seeping into my pants. I worked fast, my muscles remembering the frantic rhythm of avoiding a beating. The 2 beta women froze. They stared at me, their eyes wide with absolute horror. Lord above, the stout woman gasped, dropping her mop. "What are you doing?" "Stop. Stop that right now." She sounded panicked. Panic meant I was doing it wrong. Panic meant a strike was coming. I scrubbed harder, my breathing turning jagged. "I've got it," I muttered, not looking up. My wet hand slipped on the wooden handle of the brush. "I'm fast. I'll get the pots next. Just tell the boss I'm working. Tell him I'm earning it." No, child, please." The other woman fluttered her hands, terrified to touch me, but desperate to stop me. "If Lord Alistair sees you on your knees in the dirt." A shadow blocked the doorway, plunging the scullery into sudden, heavy twilight. The smell of ozone, pine, and wet earth hit the room like a physical shockwave. "Gideon." The two beta women immediately dropped their gazes to the floor, shrinking back against the counters. I froze, my hands still submerged in the dirty, greasy water. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I thought it might finally break the bones completely. Gideon stood in the doorway. He was wearing dark riding boots and a thick wool sweater. He looked massive, taking up the entire frame. His amber eyes swept over the scene, the terrified betas, the spilled water, and me half-naked, shivering, scrubbing the floor like a desperate dog. A low, rumbling growl vibrated in Gideon's chest. It wasn't loud, but the frequency of it rattled the copper pots hanging from the ceiling. I dropped the brush. It clattered against the stone. I scrambled backward, slipping in the grease, hitting my shoulder hard against the heavy wooden leg of the prep table. I pulled my knees up, throwing my arms over my head in a defensive crouch. Here it comes, my brain screamed. Asterisk, you ruined his floor. You scared his staff. Brace for impact, asterisk. I waited for the heavy boot to connect with my ribs. I waited for the massive hands to drag me up by my hair. Instead, the growl stopped. I heard the heavy thud of Gideon's boots stepping into the puddle. Then the sound of fabric tearing. I peeked out from under my arms. Gideon had ripped a clean linen towel off a nearby rack. He dropped to his knees right in the filthy water, ruining his dark trousers. He reached out, his massive hands moving with deliberate, agonizing slowness, and wrapped the dry linen around my wet, shaking hands. I'm sorry. I babbled, the words spilling out of my mouth like bile. I was just trying to work. I wasn't trying to steal anything. I'll clean it better. Oh, Elias. Stop. Gideon's voice was rough, choked with a thick, heavy emotion that smelled like burnt ozone. He didn't pull me to him. He just held my wrapped hands. Look at me. I couldn't. I stared at his chest. I said, look at me, pup. The alpha command was there, but it wasn't a crushing weight. It was a gentle, irresistible upward pull. I lifted my chin. His amber eyes were shining. The pupils were dilated until they were almost entirely black. You don't work, Gideon said, his voice trembling slightly. You don't scrub floors. You don't haul pots. You don't earn your keep. You are the omega of this house. The only thing you own in this kitchen is everything in it. He let go of my hands and, carefully avoiding the dark bruises on my ribs, slid his massive arms under my knees and my shoulders. He stood up, lifting me effortlessly against his chest. His body heat was absurd. It was like being pressed against a furnace. I was completely off the ground. My legs dangled. I was entirely at his mercy. And yet, as he carried me out of the scullery, ignoring the dirty water dripping from my clothes onto the pristine hallway carpets, I didn't feel the urge to struggle. I just felt incredibly, deeply tired. Let's get you warm, Gideon mumbled into my hair. And then we are going to feed you. The dining room was a masterclass in intimidation. Dark mahogany paneling, a vaulted ceiling, and a table long enough to seat 20. I was seated at one end, the polished wood reflecting the gray, overcast light filtering through the massive bay windows. Alistair sat at the head of the table to my right. Reese was directly across from me. Gideon sat to my left, his large frame crowding my space in a way that should have triggered my claustrophobia, but instead acted like a solid, warm wall between me and the rest of the room. A beta servant placed a bowl in front of me. The smell hit my starved senses like a physical blow. Venison stew, rich, thick gravy, chunks of tender meat, roasted root vegetables, and a loaf of warm, crusty bread swimming in melted butter on a side plate. My mouth flooded with saliva so fast it actually hurt the glands in my jaw. In the pits, food was a weapon. You fought for the scraps. If you didn't eat fast, someone bigger would punch you in the throat and take your bowl. You didn't chew. You swallowed. And you protected your plate with your forearms. I gripped the heavy silver spoon. It felt clumsy in my bruised fingers. I looked at the three alphas. Alistair was drinking from a crystal goblet. The liquid inside was dark, thick, and unmistakably crimson. Blood. He drank it with the casual elegance of a man sipping fine wine, his silver eyes fixed on me. Reese was cutting a small piece of plain toast, pushing it around his plate. Gideon had a plate piled high with meat, but he wasn't eating. He was watching my hands. "Go ahead," Alistair said softly, lowering his goblet. "It's yours." The permission was all it took. Logic vanished. My rational brain, the part that knew my shrunken stomach couldn't handle rich food, shut down entirely. The starving animal took the wheel. I hunched over the bowl, wrapping my left arm entirely around it to block anyone from snatching it away. I dug the spoon in and shoveled the scalding hot stew into my mouth. I didn't chew the meat. I swallowed it whole. It burned my throat on the way down, a glorious, heavy heat. I grabbed the buttered bread with my bare hand, tearing off a massive chunk and shoving it into my mouth alongside the stew. "Elias." Slowed down. Gideon warned, a low rumble of concern in his voice. He reached a hand out toward my arm. I flinched violently, snarling around a mouthful of bread. I pulled the bowl closer to my chest, gravy slopping over the edge onto the pristine white tablecloth. I glared at him, my good eye wild and feral. "Mine?" Gideon immediately pulled his hand back, raising both palms in surrender. Okay. It's yours. Take your time." I didn't take my time. I emptied the bowl in under 2 minutes, scraping the silver spoon against the porcelain until it squeaked, getting every last drop of grease. When it was gone, I dropped the spoon. My chest was heaving. I sat back, wiping my gravy-stained mouth with the back of my hand. I felt a sudden, euphoric rush of fullness, a heavy-weighted sensation in my gut that I hadn't felt in years. Then the cold sweat hit. It started at the base of my neck, a terrible, icy clamminess. My stomach gave a hard, violent churn. The rich butter, the heavy venison, the sheer volume of food hitting an organ that had subsisted on watery gruel and moldy scraps for 5 years. It was a chemical rebellion. A sharp cramp folded me in half. I gasped, grabbing the edge of the mahogany table, my knuckles turning white. The taste of copper and bile flooded the back of my throat. No. The thought was pure, unadulterated terror. Asterisk no. Do not waste the food. They will kill you, asterisk. I clamped my mouth shut, swallowing hard against the rising tide. My eyes watered. I trembled violently, trying to force my body to digest, trying to override my own failing biology. Elias. Reese's chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. I couldn't speak. Another cramp hit, tighter and more agonizing than the first. I gagged, a wet, choking sound escaping my clamped lips. I barely registered Alistair moving. 1 second, he was at the head of the table. The next, he was kneeling beside my chair. The vampire lord moved with terrifying, instantaneous speed. He didn't grab me. He simply slid a large, empty silver serving basin off the table and held it directly under my chin. "Let it go, little wolf," Alistair commanded. His voice wasn't an alpha order. It was a hypnotic, soothing velvet ribbon. "Do not fight it. You are sick. Let it out." The gentleness of his tone broke the dam. I lurched forward, gripping the edges of the silver basin with trembling hands, and violently threw up everything I had just eaten. The spasms wrecked my abused ribs, sending blinding flashes of pain through my torso. I retched until there was nothing left but acidic bile. Tears streamed from my eyes. Snot ran down my face. It was humiliating. It was disgusting. I had ruined their meal. I had wasted their expensive food. I dropped my head, resting my forehead against the cold rim of the basin, panting heavily. I waited for the slap. I waited for the disgust. I waited for Alistair to drag me out by my ear and throw me out into the rain for being a broken, useless creature. A cold, pale hand settled gently on the back of my neck. Alistair didn't flinch away from the smell or the mess. He slowly, rhythmically stroked the damp hair at the nape of my neck. "Gideon, Alistair said quietly, his hands still resting on my skin. "Have the kitchens prepare a clear bone broth. Just the broth. And some ginger tea. Right away," Gideon murmured. I heard his heavy footsteps rapidly leaving the room. Reese reappeared on my other side. He handed Alistair a damp, warm cloth. Alistair took it and gently, methodically wiped my mouth and my chin. "I'm sorry," I croaked, my voice destroyed. I kept my eyes squeezed shut, unable to look at the ruin in the basin. "I'll clean it." "I'm sorry. There is nothing to apologize for," Alistair replied smoothly. He signaled a servant, who silently whisked the soiled basin away. "Your body has forgotten how to be nourished. We will teach it slowly. A spoonful at a time, if we must." I finally opened my eyes and looked at him. The vampire lord was crouched beside me, wiping away my sick with his own hands. His silver eyes were completely devoid of judgment. The terrifying reality crashed down on me, heavier than any physical blow I had ever taken. I wasn't in a fighting pit anymore. I was somewhere far more dangerous. I was somewhere they were going to try and fix me. And I had no idea how to survive that. They moved me to a smaller room. It wasn't a punishment, though my brain instantly categorized it as one. Reese had quietly suggested it after the dining room incident, his dark eyes analyzing my rigid posture and the way I kept my back pressed against the mahogany chair. "The primary suite has too much negative space," he had told Alistair. "His nervous system is treating every open corner as a threat vector. So they put me in what used to be a reading room in the East Wing. It was cramped compared to the rest of the estate, but still the size of a standard pit boss office. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. It smelled heavily of old paper dust and Reese's clove-scented blood. The bed here was smaller, tucked securely into an alcove. 3 solid walls. Only one open side to defend. I sat cross-legged in the center of the mattress, a ceramic mug of clear bone broth gripped in both hands. The ginger burned pleasantly on my raw throat. Gideon was sitting on the floor by the door. He had a piece of soft leather in his hands and a small knife, methodically whittling down a wooden peg. He wasn't watching me. He was deliberately giving me his profile, making himself appear smaller, less predatory. Alistair was gone. He had a territory to run, ledgers to balance. Or perhaps he just needed to wash the smell of my vomit off his pristine clothes. I took a tiny sip of the broth. It stayed down. My stomach gave a low, unhappy gurgle, but the agonizing cramps had subsided. Outside, the gray afternoon finally broke. A low rumble of thunder shook the thick glass of the window panes, followed immediately by a sharp, blinding crack of lightning. I flinched, splashing hot broth onto my knuckles. In the pits, thunderstorms meant the underground fighting rings would flood. It meant fighting in knee-deep, freezing mud. It meant the crowd would be louder, drunker, meaner, screaming over the sound of the rain. The smell of ozone always preceded a massacre. Another crack of thunder, this one loud enough to rattle the books on the shelves. My breath hitched. The walls of the room seemed to contract. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the lightning flashed bright enough to pierce my eyelids. I wasn't in the bed anymore. I was back in the mud. I could smell the copper of my own blood and the sour sweat of the beastman who had shattered my ribs. I could hear the roar of the crowd. Asterisk, Elias. Asterisk. A heavy, rough hand settled over both of my shaking hands, completely enveloping the mug of broth. My eyes flew open. Gideon was kneeling beside the bed. He had moved across the room in the space between lightning strikes. I hadn't heard him. The smell of wet earth and pine slammed into me, entirely drowning out the ozone of the storm outside. Gideon's amber eyes were glowing slightly in the dim room. His pupils were blown wide. "Breathe out," he ordered. The alpha tone wasn't commanding. It was an anchor. Heavy, solid, dropped straight into the churning sea of my panic. I realized my lungs were burning. I had been holding my breath, bracing for a hit that wasn't coming. I let out a ragged, stuttering exhale. I'm here, I gasped, trying to orient myself. I'm working. I'm fine. You're not working, Gideon rumbled. He carefully pried the mug out of my rigid fingers and set on the nightstand. You're safe. No such thing. I muttered automatically. Gideon didn't argue. He just shifted his weight, sitting on the edge of the mattress. The springs groaned under his massive frame. He didn't try to pull me into a hug. He knew better. Instead, he leaned his broad back against the wall of the alcove, stretching his long legs out over the quilt, effectively barricading the open side of the bed. He took up all the space. He blocked the view of the window and the flashing lightning. He radiated heat like an iron stove. My pack used to sleep in a pile, Gideon said quietly, picking up his whittling knife and the leather strap again. His voice was a low, steady drone that vibrated against the mattress. When storms rolled over the mountains, the pups would get spooked. The elders would form a ring. Bodies blocked the sound. Scent blocks the fear. I sat perfectly still, my knees pulled to my chest. Gideon was a wolf, a shifter. I had suspected it, but the confirmation made my skin prickle. Shifter alphas were notoriously territorial. They didn't take in broken, useless omegas. They demanded strong mates to bear litters. I don't smell like a pack, I pointed out, my voice raspy. I smell like rot and cheap soap. Gideon paused his carving. He turned his head slowly, fixing me with those glowing amber eyes. You smell like a survivor, he said. And you smell like Alistair, cedar. Soon you'll smell like my woods. You think scent is something you're born with, Elias? Scent is shared. It's built. He went back to carving the peg. Lay down, Gideon added, not looking at me. I'll keep watch. The storm isn't getting past this bed. It was a ridiculous concept. A massive lethal alpha sitting guard duty over a ruined pit fighter simply because it was raining. But as another boom of thunder rattled the house, the sound felt distant, muffled by Gideon's broad shoulders and the overwhelming scent of deep, quiet forests. I uncurled my stiff legs. I kept my back to the wall, but I slid down until my head hit the pillow. I kept my eyes on Gideon's broad back. I expected the paranoia to keep me awake, calculating the distance between his knife and my throat. But the heat radiating from him seeped into my aching joints. The rhythmic sh-sh-sh sound of his knife shaving would acted like a metronome. My eyelids grew heavy. For the first time in my life, I fell asleep while a predator was in the room. 2 days passed. The rain stopped, but the damp cold settled into the bones of the estate. My body, finally realizing it didn't have to stockpile adrenaline to survive the next hour, completely crashed. I slept for 14 hours at a time. When I was awake, I was weak, shaking, consumed by a terrifying, hollow exhaustion. I managed to keep the clear broth down, then mashed root vegetables. Small, mechanical victories. But the pain didn't stop. Without the constant flood of adrenaline, the true extent of my injuries made themselves known. My back was a canvas of tight, inflexible scar tissue that pulled agonizingly every time I inhaled. My ribs throbbed with a deep, sickening ache. Reese walked into my small room just after noon on the third day. He carried a heavy black leather satchel. He smelled, as always, of cloves and blood. Sit up, Elias, Reese said. His tone was brisk, devoid of Gideon's rough warmth or Alistair's intense, suffocating possession. It was clinical. I pushed myself up, wincing as the muscles on my lower back seized. I pulled the quilt up to my chin. Reese set the satchel on a heavy wooden chair and unbuckled it. He pulled out a stack of clean white linen squares, a small silver bowl, and a dark glass jar. Your mobility is declining, Reese stated, pulling a chair close to the edge of the bed and sitting down. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. Your nervous system is calming down, which means the localized numbing effect of your chronic trauma response is fading. You are feeling your scars for the first time in years. I always feel them, I muttered defensively. You feel the mechanism of them, Reese corrected smoothly. You feel the restriction. You're only just now feeling the inflammation. Take your shirt off. I froze. I've been wearing the same oversized gray wool sweater for 3 days. It was my armor. It hid the ruin, showing them the scars in the dim light of a bathroom, covered in steam and water, was one thing. Exposing them in the harsh, gray daylight streaming through the window was entirely different. No. The words slipped out before I could weigh the consequences. Reese didn't blink. He unscrewed the lid of the dark jar. The sharp, medicinal smell of eucalyptus, crushed mint, and something heavy and metallic filled the room. I am an anatomist, Elias. I spent 2 centuries putting broken soldiers back together on battlefields. I am not interested in the aesthetic of your skin. I am interested in the inelasticity of your dermis. The whip marks on your back are adhering to the muscle fascia. If we do not break down the scar tissue, you will eventually lose the ability to rotate your torso. He dipped 2 pale fingers into the jar, scooping out a thick, greenish-black salve. Turn around. Take the shirt off. It wasn't an alpha command. It was a doctor's order. But the flat expectation of compliance terrified me more than a shout. My hand shook as I grabbed the hem of the sweater. I pulled it over my head, the friction sending a spark of pain across my shoulders. I dropped the wool onto the quilt and slowly, agonizingly, turned my back to Reese. I kept my chin tucked to my chest, my eyes squeezed shut. I waited for the gasp. I waited for the pitying click of his tongue. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then 2 freezing cold hands pressed flat against my shoulder blades. I violently arched my spine, a sharp hiss tearing through my teeth. The sudden cold against my inflamed skin was shocking, but a split second later, the deep, numbing relief of the temperature sank into the burning muscle. Easy, Reese murmured, his voice right by my ear. Vampire physiology has its uses. I can draw the heat out of the inflammation. He began to spread the salve. His touch was completely devoid of hesitation. He didn't gingerly skirt around the worst of the raised keloids. He pressed directly into them. His cold, strong fingers found the hard, knotted ridges of scar tissue that crisscrossed my spine and began to knead. It hurt. It was a sharp, tearing sensation as he forced the rigid skin to move against the muscle beneath it. I gripped the bed sheets, my knuckles turning white. I ground my teeth together, determined not to make a sound. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. I wouldn't show weakness. Breathe, Elias, Reese instructed calmly. His thumbs dug hard into a particularly brutal knot near my left shoulder blade, the exact spot where a spiked gauntlet had connected 3 years ago. A strangled whimper broke past my lips. I couldn't stop it. The pain was blinding. Good. Vocalize it, Reese said, his hands never stopping their relentless, rhythmic pressure. Pain in the pit was a weakness to be exploited. Here, it is simply diagnostic data. Tell me where it burns. Everywhere. I choked out. Tears of purely physical reaction pricked my eyes. It feels like tearing. It is tearing. Microtears in the fibrotic tissue. It is necessary. Reese's cold fingers slid down to my lower back, working the dark, minty salve into the burned scars. You have survived by turning your body into a stone. But stones do not heal, Elias. They just erode. You must become flesh again. He worked for 20 minutes. The sharp, tearing pain gradually shifted into a deep, heavy ache, followed by a strange, tingling warmth as the blood finally rushed back into areas that had been starved of circulation for years. When Reese finally pulled his hands away, I slumped forward, exhausted. My forehead rested on my knees. My back was slick with the pungent salve, but for the first time in memory, the constant, suffocating tightness pulling at my spine was gone. I could take a full, deep breath without my ribs screaming. Reese wiped his hands on a linen cloth. He stood up, placing the jar back in his satchel. Keep the shirt off until the salve absorbs, he said, moving toward the door. He paused, his hand on the frame. You did not flinch away. You endured the necessary pain. That requires a different kind of strength than taking a punch. I commend you, Elias. He left before I could process the words. I sat alone in the quiet room, the smell of eucalyptus clearing my head. I tentatively rolled my left shoulder. It popped loudly, but the grinding friction was gone. I looked at my hands. They were scarred, crooked, and ugly, but they weren't curled into fists. I flattened my palms against the soft quilt. The texture was strange. Not dirt, not blood, just cotton. I was becoming flesh again, and that terrified me more than the stone ever did. The fever broke on the 5th night. It was a delayed reaction, a final, violent purge of the infections and toxins that had been trapped beneath my skin for years. I woke up at midnight, my clothes soaked in sour-smelling sweat, my teeth chattering so hard my jaw ached. The small room felt like a freezer. I curled into a tight ball, wrapping the thick quilt around my shivering frame, but it wasn't enough. The cold was inside me, emanating from my marrow. The door opened. The heavy combined scent of cedar, wet earth, and cloves spilled into the room, cutting through the sour smell of my fever sweat. Alistair, Gideon, and Reese walked in. They were dressed in loose sleepwear, soft cotton and silk. They didn't look like terrifying alphas. They looked like a pack. Gideon reached the bed first. He pressed the back of his massive hand to my forehead. His skin was blistering hot against my freezing flesh. His temperature is dropping too fast. Gideon growled, panic finally threading through his usually steady voice. The fever burned him out. He has no reserves left to generate heat. Move, Alistair commanded softly. Gideon didn't argue. He stripped off his shirt, throwing it to the floor, and climbed directly into the bed. He shoved me gently toward the center of the mattress and lay down behind me, wrapping his massive arms around my waist and pulling my freezing back flush against his bare, burning chest. I gasped at the sudden contact. The instinct to thrash, to break the hold, flared instantly. I drove my elbow backward, aiming for his ribs. Gideon easily absorbed the weak blow, his grip tightening, not a restraint, an anchor. Stop fighting, little wolf. Gideon rumbled, his chest vibrating against my spine. You're freezing to death. Take the heat. Reese was on my other side. He didn't climb under the covers. Vampires didn't generate body heat the way shifters did. Instead, he pulled the heavy quilt up, tucking it tightly around Gideon and me, creating a sealed pocket of warmth. Then Reese sat on the edge of the mattress, resting his cool hand firmly on my hot, sweaty forehead, grounding me. Alistair stood at the foot of the bed. His silver eyes were dark, tracking my erratic, shallow breathing. He needs the bond, Alistair said. His voice wasn't a question. It was a heavy, terrifying fact. His omega biology is collapsing because it is unanchored. The trauma is too heavy for one body. He's not ready, Reese argued quietly, his thumb stroking my temple. He still views us as captors. A claim right now would feel like an assault. If we don't ground him, his heart will stop by morning. Gideon shot back, his arms squeezing me tighter as a violent shiver wrecked my frame. I listened to them argue over me like I was a broken machine. But for the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt a desperate, hollow craving. The heat radiating from Gideon was pulling me back from the edge of the dark, freezing abyss. The cool, steady pressure of Reese's hand was keeping my fragmented mind from shattering. And the heavy, suffocating scent of Alistair's cedar was the only thing filling my lungs. They were right. I was dying. The stone was cracking, and I didn't know how to survive as flesh. Alistair. My voice was a ruined, broken whisper. It was the first time I had used his name. The vampire lord moved instantly. He appeared at the side of the bed, kneeling next to Reese. His pale face was inches from mine. I'm here, Alistair breathed. I looked at him with my good eye. The swelling had finally gone down, leaving a sickly yellow stain across my cheek. I knew what I looked like, a starved, ruined, filthy thing. I don't. I swallowed hard, fighting a wave of nausea. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be yours. I only know how to take a hit. Alistair reached under the quilt. He didn't grab my wrist. He gently cupped my bruised jaw, his thumb brushing over the cracked skin of my lower lip. You never have to take a hit again, Elias. Alistair swore. His silver eyes blazed with a fierce, possessive light that finally, miraculously, didn't terrify me. You do not need to know how to be ours. You already are. You simply have to let us carry the weight. I looked at him. I felt Gideon's heart beating against my back, a steady, heavy drum. I smelled Reese's cloves. I looked at the velvet cage they had built for me. It wasn't a cage. It was a fortress. And the monsters were on the outside. I closed my eyes. I uncurled my fists. I let my head fall back against Gideon's shoulder, turning my face into Alistair's cool palm. I stopped bracing for the impact. Okay. I whispered into the dark. Carry it. Alistair leaned down, pressing his lips to my forehead, right over Reese's fingers. Gideon buried his face in my neck, inhaling my broken scent. The pain didn't magically vanish. My ribs still ached. The scars on my back still pulled tight. The nightmares would still come. But as the terrifying absolute safety of the pack finally swallowed me whole, I knew the worst of the bleeding had stopped. I was broken, but I was home. Weeks passed. The winter deepened, but inside the estate, the cold could not reach me. I learned the rhythms of the house, the way Gideon's boots echoed in the hallways before he entered a room, the way Reese's glasses fogged when he drank his morning blood tea, the way Alistair's silver eyes softened when he watched me eat without throwing up. I learned to eat slowly, to chew, to taste. I learned to sleep in the bed, the big one, the one that had once felt like drowning. It took time. It took Gideon's warmth beside me, his massive body a solid, unshakable presence that made the soft mattress feel less like a trap and more like a nest. It took Reese's quiet presence in the armchair by the fire, reading ancient texts in the dim light, his scent a steady, grounding anchor. It took Alistair's cool hand on my forehead, stroking the hair back from my face, humming a low, soothing tune that I later learned was a vampire lullaby from Before the Burning. And it took the scent of pack, of belonging. It started subtly. I catch a whiff of cedar on my own skin, mixed with something wild and earthy, pine and thunder. I'd smell it on the pillows, on the clothes they left for me, in the very air of the room that had become mine. I began to crave it. The scent of them. The safety of it. The first time I went into heat was 3 weeks after the fever broke. I woke up disoriented, my skin burning, my body aching in ways that had nothing to do with old injuries. The sheets were soaked. My thighs were slick. A desperate, primal hunger clawed at my insides, demanding something I couldn't name. I knew what it was, of course. I'd had heats before. In the pits, they'd been a nightmare. Isolated in a cold, dark cell, left to suffer through the fever and the need alone. The alphas in the compound had never touched me during heat. I was too damaged, too broken, too much of a risk. They'd throw me in a cell and let me scream until it passed. But this time I wasn't alone. The door burst open. Gideon was there first, his amber eyes blazing, his scent spiking with something wild and possessive. He was in the middle of shifting, his canines had elongated, his pupils blown wide, the wolf bleeding through his human form. Elias. His voice was a growl, rough and strained. You're in heat. I can smell you. I can. Gideon. Reese's voice cut through the haze, sharp and commanding. Control yourself. You're scaring him. I was trembling. Not from fear, not entirely. My body was screaming at me to reach for him, to drag him into the bed, to let him. Breathe, little wolf. Alistair's cool hand found my forehead, pressing down, grounding me. We are not going to take you. Not like this. Not until you're ready. I gasped, the heat licking up my spine. I need I know what you need. Alistair's silver eyes were dark, his control absolute. But you need to ask for it. With your words. Not because your body demands it. Because you choose it. It took hours. Hours of Gideon's heat against my back, his arms wrapped around me, his scent flooding my senses. Hours of Reese's cool hands on my burning skin, grounding me, drawing out the fever. Hours of Alistair's voice in my ear, low and steady, talking me through the waves of need. And when it was over, when the fever finally broke and I lay exhausted in a tangle of sheets, Alistair pressed his lips to my forehead. Next time, he murmured. You will ask, and we will answer. The next time came sooner than I expected. It was Gideon who triggered it. He had been restless all day, pacing the hallways, his sense sour with something I didn't recognize. He avoided me. He wouldn't meet my eyes. When I tried to approach him, he backed away, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Don't. His voice was ragged. I can't. You smell too good, Elias. I can't control it. I never seen him like this. The alpha who had carried me out of the scullery, who had wrapped me in his heat during the storm, who had been nothing but patient and gentle, he was unraveling. Reese, I called, my voice sharp with panic. Something's wrong with Gideon. Reese appeared in the doorway. He took one look at Gideon, at the trembling in his massive frame, the sheen of sweat on his brow, and his expression softened. He's in rut, Reese said quietly. His alpha instincts are demanding he claim you. He's fighting it. He doesn't want to hurt you. Hurt me. I stared at Gideon, at the way his hands were clenched into fists, the way his entire body seemed to vibrate with tension. He's not going to hurt me. Elias, you don't understand. Gideon's voice was a broken growl. I can't. If I lose control, I could. Then don't lose control. I stepped toward him, my heart pounding. I trust you, Gideon. I trust you. The words hung in the air between us. I meant them. I meant them with every scarred, broken piece of me. Gideon made a sound, low, wounded noise that was half groan, half sob. He crossed the distance between us in 2 strides and pulled me into his arms. His mouth found my neck, his teeth grazing the scent gland there. I gasped, my knees buckling. He caught me, lowering us both to the floor. Tell me to stop, he rasped against my skin. Tell me, and I will. Don't stop. I whispered. Don't ever stop. He marked me that night. His teeth sank into the curve of my shoulder, a sharp, bright pain that melted into pleasure. The scent of pine and thunder flooded my senses, filling me with warmth, with safety, with belonging. Gideon's rut was violent and all-consuming, but he held himself back. He was gentle when he needed to be, fierce when I begged for it. And through it all, Alistair and Reese were there, watching, guarding, making sure I was never overwhelmed, never hurt, never afraid. When it was over, Gideon collapsed beside me, his massive body trembling, his face buried in my hair. You're ours, he muttered, his voice thick with exhaustion and wonder. You're really ours. I know, I whispered. I always have been. The first time Alistair claimed me was different. Slower. Deliberate. It happened on a clear winter night, the stars sharp and cold through the window. Alistair found me in the reading room, curled up in my usual corner with a book I couldn't read. My eyes kept sliding off the page, distracted by the scent of cedar that seemed to follow me everywhere. Elias. His voice was soft, but it carried the weight of a command. Come here. I went to him. I always went to him. He cupped my face in his cool hands, tilting my chin up so I could meet his silver eyes. His thumb traced the line of my jaw, the curve of my cheek, the split in my eyebrow that had never healed right. You have been through so much, he murmured. You have survived so much, and you have let us in piece by piece. Do you know how brave that is? I shook my head, my throat tight. It is the bravest thing I have ever seen. Alistair pressed his forehead to mine. I have lived for centuries. I have seen empires rise and fall. And I have never met anyone like you, Elias. You are not broken. You are forged, and you are mine. His claim was gentle. A soft bite at the junction of my neck and shoulder, not piercing the skin, just pressing, marking, claiming. The scent of cedar flooded my senses, overwhelming and intoxicating. I felt the bond snap into place, a thread of connection between us, warm and golden and unbreakable. I could feel his emotions, his pride, his fierce, possessive love, his ancient, quiet joy. I could also feel his hunger, his need, and I knew without a doubt that I was safe with him. I'm ready, I whispered. I've been ready. He took me on the floor of the reading room, in the shaft of moonlight that fell through the window. It was slow and tender, and he never stopped whispering against my skin. How beautiful I was, how strong, how loved. When it was over, I lay in his arms, trembling and whole. Reese next. I asked, my voice sleepy. Reese next. Alistair agreed. But he will be patient. He has waited for you for a very long time. Reese claimed me on a cold, gray morning, when the frost painted patterns on the windows and the fire crackled in the hearth. He had been patient, so patient. He had never pushed, never demanded. He had simply been there, a steady presence at my side, his clove-scented blood a constant comfort. But when he finally kissed me, it was with a hunger that surprised me. His hands were cold, but his lips were hot, and when he pulled back, his eyes were dark with desire. I have been waiting, he said, his voice rough, waiting for you to be ready, waiting for you to choose me. I choose you. I cupped his face in my hands. I choose all of you. Always. He marked me carefully, deliberately, his teeth sinking into the curve of my hip, where the scars were thickest. The bond that snapped into place was different from Alistair's, cooler, quieter, but no less powerful. I could feel his emotions through it. His deep, abiding love. His fierce protectiveness. His quiet, scholarly joy. He took me on the bed, surrounded by Gideon's warmth and Alistair's scent. It was slow and gentle, and he never stopped touching me, tracing the maps of my scars with his cool fingers. You are beautiful, he said when it was over. Every line, every mark. You are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. The night we became a true pack, all four of us bound together in a way that transcended biology, was the night of the full moon. Gideon shifted first, his massive wolf form stretching out on the floor of the great hall. He was magnificent, silver-gray fur, amber eyes that glowed with ancient wisdom, a presence that demanded respect and offered protection in equal measure. Alistair knelt beside him, his pale hand resting on Gideon's fur. Reese stood behind me, his hands on my shoulders, grounding me. Come, little wolf. Gideon's voice echoed in my mind, the pack bond, strengthening with each passing moment. Join us. I stepped forward, my heart pounding. I could feel the pull of the moon, the tug of the pack bond, the overwhelming rightness of it all. Gideon pressed his muzzle to my chest, right over my heart. Alistair cupped my face in his hands. Reese's arms wrapped around me from behind. And in that moment, surrounded by my alphas, my pack, my home, I felt the last of my walls crumble. I was broken, but I was theirs, and that was more than enough.